start to the new year. Can you guys hear me? I'm just wondering sometimes I just wonder whether I'm just talking to myself, but it's okay. Oh, gee. All right. Okay, I have actually put up the media articles right on Edmodo, but I wasn't sure if you guys have been to Edmodo since the holidays because I haven't seen anybody actually um, any reaction from you guys on the stuff that I have posted on Edmodo. I think you guys should have seen this, right? There's a little Christmas present here somewhere on Edmodo. Some of you have already seen it, some of you haven't. So just make sure that you guys actually go into Edmodo and look for the little present. Yeah, it's a treasure hunt. It's a search party. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you where to look for it. I'm going to leave it to you guys to go find it. For those of you who have found it, I hope you find it useful. Yeah. Okay, so it's one of those things that I usually do for classes that I teach. And this being the first year that I'm teaching it, I actually had to go through it quite a bit. I mean, there's quite a number of stuff that I needed. I mean, quite a number of years that I had to go look through and categorize and organize. So yeah, it's hard work. So I hope that you guys would also put in your own sweat and tears and hard work um, in your studies as well. Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at some of the media articles that I've put up for today. I thought this was actually quite a good article, just timely for what we are doing today on small powers, right? Small states. Yeah, the art of survival for Central Asian states actually looks at this group of states that were dissolved from the USSR, right, and how they are hedging and balancing the global superpowers in their bid to survive, right? 30 years from the dissolution of the USSR. Okay, so this is actually quite an interesting one because it actually looks at the different Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc. And I'm quite sure you guys have seen that Kazakhstan is having a bit of a problem now, right? It's been having unrest the last couple of, at least the last week or so. Okay, and then there's South Korea, right? Talking about where South Korea's loyalties lie. Yeah, and of course, South Korea is in a very interesting position because it is actually um, basically caught between the US and China, especially now with the two countries, right, going into strategic competition and basically dialing up, right, their hostilities and all that, their tone towards each other. So, um, South Korea being I mean, you would probably see it as a middle power now, right? But it still has the hangover of being a more or less a small state. Yeah. So it's looking at this World Politics Review is looking at why and how South Korea is starting to signal its um, uh, its support for the U.S. right, but at the same time trying to still be on the right side of China. Okay, Sudan. I think you also saw that what happened in Sudan. It's kind of related to what we've been talking about. I mean, it's just a continuation, right, of the protests in November and the military coup, right, and then how Hamdok who's the Sudan's prime minister, actually signed the deal with the military, right? Which later on, I mean, of course, delegitimized him as the civilian leader, right? The protesters were quite unhappy with him because they felt that he basically legitimized the military coup. Yeah. So this actually is looking at the fact that he stepped down, right? He stepped down on Sunday, right? So this actually looks at what's going to happen, right? Post Hamdok. Okay, NATO foreign ministers, of course, held emergency talks on Ukraine. This was a couple of days ago. Or actually, they are going to hold emergency talks on Friday, this coming Friday. Yeah, a couple of days ago, Blinken actually met with his German counterpart. I think it was yesterday or the day before, and they're trying to forge a united stand, right, against Russia. But of course, Germany, being the recipient of the gas pipe, right, from Russia, is in a very funny position right now, right? But of course, the current German foreign minister is part of the Green Party, and she has actually said that they will stand by what they had agreed, right? That they will suspend the Nord Stream 2 if, let's say, if let's say Russia were to attack Ukraine. Yeah. Okay, this is an interesting sort of like turn of events in Lithuania, right? Because basically, as you know, Lithuania has actually earned the ire and the wrath of China because it actually allowed Taiwan to open a representative office, right, with using the island's name. And now the Lithuanian president has actually come forward and said that allowing Taiwan to use the name was a mistake. Right. So this, I mean, all along, since Taiwan actually opened up its representative office, China has been very angry, and of course, there's downgraded the um, diplomatic ties with Lithuania to to signal its unhappiness. Um, so yeah, so this is the first time that somebody of clout, of political standing in Lithuania has actually acknowledged that they had done, they had it was a mistake, and China's foreign minister, of course, foreign ministry spokesman, of course, said that it was a step in the right direction, but this could also be due to the fact that a lot of Lithuanian businesses are um, sort of in a um, in a mire right now because quite a number of its shipments can't clear through Chinese customs, and so they are actually trying to put pressure, right, on maybe on the government to try to smoothen relations with China. Okay, this is an interesting article on the ongoing, right, Iran nuclear talks. Um, Israel is starting to sort of like come around to the idea that um, the negotiations could actually um, go ahead, and a nuclear deal could be forged out of this round of talks. Um, yeah, and basically, I think the security or the security um, agency head of the security agency said that basically having that nuclear deal may be a good thing. That's kind of like slightly different from what they have been pushing for, right? They have been pushing for the signatories to the deal to actually walk away from it. Yeah, but behind the scenes, Israel is still lobbying, right? Lobbying, especially the U.S., right, not to give in on the major principles. Of course, one of the things that Israel is unhappy about is the sunset clause, which actually allows some of the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program to be lifted in 2025 and 2030. Right, so that's quite soon. Yeah. Okay. Oops. All right, let's take a look at. Okay, so that was Israel. Bahrain actually has appointed its first ambassador to Syria in over a decade. This has been almost a decade since the start of the Syrian war, I guess, the civil war. Yeah, so yeah, so this is um, sort of a step in trying to normalize the relations with Syria. And of course, last month UAE actually opened its mission to Damascus. Uh, so that's you see, in the Middle East, they're actually starting to ramp up, their diplomatic ties with their neighbors and with Syria, with the withdrawal of the U.S. Of course, moving out of or change, turning its attention to the Indo-Pacific because of China. Okay, Morocco is apparently, according to foreign policy, right, becoming more isolated. Um, it's basically having a lot of problems with its diplomatic ties with different countries, um, and yeah, and apparently the U.S. consensus on Morocco has shifted away. Um, no, I mean, they no longer has the unwavering support of the two parties in U.S., and this was reflected in the recent National Defense Authorization Act, yeah, which basically is possibly going to sour relations between the U.S. and Morocco. Morocco actually last year severed official diplomatic communication with Germany over some disagreements that it had, and also withdrew its ambassador to Spain. Right, so it's been basically slowly withdrawing itself from the international um, arena, and yeah, it's becoming a little bit turning a little bit hostile to all its allies as well. So it's interesting to see what's happening there. Okay, there's been quite a number of write-ups about sanctions, about economic sanctions that the U.S. has been um, putting in place, right? And apparently, if you look at this, I think it's Orange County Register's um, article says that basically it's been, economic sanctions has always been the rule rather than the exception in U.S. diplomacy, and it's also become um, the the sort of diplomatic tool, right, that the Biden administration has been using as well. Yeah. And then there's this write up about the sanctions on Russia, or the threatened sanctions on Russia for its possible invasion of Ukraine. This person that wrote it actually said that it could actually backfire. Yeah. So I thought that this would be a good look at some of the what's been going on. I mean, the U.S. has been threatening sanctions, right? So this would be a good look at what's at an opinion piece, right, on the sanctions. And then, of course, Nicaragua, as you know, flipped. It has actually moved towards, as it has acknowledged, right, China, and basically pulled its diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Some say that it's because the U.S. has been imposing lots of sanctions on the country, and so that has actually um, caused it to re-establish its ties with Beijing and sever its ties with Taiwan. Yeah. So it's under pressure, and of course, the U.S. Has U.S. relations with Nicaragua has actually soured over the years as well. So that's part of the reason why it hasn't had much qualms moving towards Beijing. Yeah. Okay, so there is also this was I think just yesterday. U.S. imposing sanctions against the Bosnian Serb leader Dodik, basically accusing him of trying to destabilize the region and undermining the peace accord that was signed more than 25 years ago. Yeah. So they have actually imposed, I think, it's basically imposed a travel ban and also frozen his assets as well. Okay, so again, the National Defense Authorization Act, um, it has basically quite explicitly spelled out a the approach that Washington should take with regard to the military junta. Um, so it's actually withdrawing aid to Myanmar, and also calling for the U.S. government to show support for the civilian government of Myanmar. Yeah. Okay, so there is a security cooperation treaty between Australia and Japan. That's just going to basically broaden, right, the Quad arrangement. And then there is a foreign affairs article that I had put in there, um, looking at the crisis of the global order. Basically, it's looking at the rise in illiberalism, basically authoritarianism, autocratic rule, right? Um, basically possibly overwhelming, right? Democratic, um, the spread of democracy and the democratic movement across the world. Yeah. So thought that would be an interesting read for you. Okay. Any other articles or stories that you saw that I should have included? Okay, which one? BBC. Yeah, the Kazakhstan one. Yes, that was the one that I was referring to. I didn't put it up in here. I think I put it into the SIR list of media articles instead. But yeah, I could always add that to here because they have actually suspended um, the parliament and declared a state of emergency. Whoops. A second. Yeah. Yeah. So they have actually uh, declared a state of emergency in Kazakhstan and asking, of course, they are asking for the Russian um, allies to help, right? To help bring in calm, peace and calm to the place. Okay, so they are appealing to one of the regional security arrangements, which is spearheaded by Russia. Okay. Anything else that I need to maybe add in? Oh, by the way, I tried to finish marking the FPA assignments. I think I only got through half of it. So I think some of you might have gotten it. Some of you I haven't completed marking, but I'm hoping to do it by this weekend. Once it's done, I'll send out an email. I mean, not email. I'll put it up on at Modo. Yeah, I'll put up an announcement on at Modo so that you can check. Okay, I think I've done about half of the class. Okay. Ah, yeah. That's. I think that is also in. Yeah, that was also in that article that I put up on the Lithuanian president saying that it was a mistake to allow Taiwan to use its name on its embassy or something like that. Yeah, it's right at the bottom because they talked about that some of the shipments, right, that basically got held up by the Chinese customs. So I think Lithuania is starting to maybe think about possibly dialing down on its hostile approach towards China. Yep, that's that is a way for China to show its displeasure, right, towards the towards Lithuania. Okay, let's take a look at the slides for today. By the way, today I'm just going to cover basically block 7, right? And I realized that, I mean, okay, I had put block 7, um, I had actually stretched it over I think 3 lectures, but I'm going to just condense it all into one. Um, some of the readings that I put up there, like the one on Malaysia, right? That is actually part of the readings um, that was in the online materials, I think, by Alden, right? So you all should read that for like a case study. So I'm not going to go through case studies per se, right? I mean, because most of the readings that I have assigned for this blog were mostly case studies, like for the GCCs, the Gulf Cooperation Council. There was South Korea. There was Malaysia as well, right? So I'm not going to go through those. I'm going to leave it to you guys to go through because they are more like case studies. So what I'm going to do is just concentrate on the more of the what do you call it, the um, framework, the theories, right? I think I'm not sure if because I've actually gone back to update some of the readings for FPA. I might have to upload those or actually update your reading list for FPA for this block as well as the previous one, the block 6. Yeah, um, on the media, right, and social media, etc. Let me just check what did I put for you guys in the original syllabus because I am let's see, block 7. Because I'm actually asking you to look at Schreller, right? Because Schreller actually talks about the concept of middle power, which I did put into your reading list. Um, I have also brought in Casimirus and Vinendal, which was something that I have put in for the I think the small powers. Okay, so if you look at the list of references for these deck of slides right at the end um, of the lecture notes, you will see which are the readings that I have actually summarized and referred to in this deck of slides. Yeah. Okay, so these are the learning outcomes for block 7. So basically, at the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify and contrast 3 basic state types in foreign policy. You should be able to describe their particular characteristics and evaluate how these impact upon their foreign policy agenda. and assess emerging powers and how their foreign policy reflects that status. So I believe in your readings, right? I did put in, I think, something on China as well, right? Yeah, I think I did put in something on China, foreign policy activities of China in the Middle East. So that should, I mean, you should be able to read about China's trade also in Africa, right? So remember that for emerging powers, right, we would actually see China as an emerging power, right? So you will want to look at those readings on China for if you're actually interested in looking at emerging powers. Yeah. Okay, so here is the three basic types state types that Alden actually highlighted, right, in his chapter on the major, middle, and small powers or small states. Yeah. So basically, he's looking at major powers, middle powers, and small states. All right, let's take a look at how we define great powers and also major powers. So this is basically a video from Council on Foreign Relations looking at great power rivalry in foreign policy.
A great power is a country that has accumulated or simply possesses a critical mass of capacity, economic above all, but economic then often translates into military, diplomatic, and other forms, and essentially at any moment in history, one can usually pinpoint several countries that have achieved something of a critical mass. There is great power rivalry. There's also great power cooperation. They coexist in this world. After the Napoleonic Wars, you had the Congress of Vienna, which brought together the principal powers of that era. And even though they agreed on some things and disagreed on others, they set up some rules for international relations. Throughout much of the 20th century, the great powers were at loggerheads, and it led to two world wars. Later on in the 20th century, you only had two great powers, and that resulted in 4 decades of Cold War. We're now at a moment of history when there's only one truly great power, which is the United States. And let me just be clear, even though the United States is great, there's still limits to what the United States can accomplish. And then there's a number of medium-sized powers out there: China, Japan, India, Russia, Europe. But this is a somewhat uncharacteristic moment in history where the United States is, if you will, first among unequals. We're fortunate to live in a world where the United States does not face a great power rival. No one in his right mind would want to live in a world where the United States faced on a day-to-day basis a great power rival like Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan or the Soviet Union. Indeed, one of the complicated features of this moment of history is, unlike the Cold War, when it was easy to identify the principal threat to the United States, in some ways now it's much more complicated to come up with a way of identifying and, more important, assessing the threats. One way to think, though, about foreign policy and diplomacy is to see that the weight of this balance in great power relations turns out to be more cooperative than combative. If the United States and China, just to take the most obvious pairing, end up as a Cold War, akin to the U.S.-Soviet relationship, neither country will benefit, and I would see it as a real failure of American and Chinese foreign policy and diplomacy. That's one way to think about the diplomatic challenge for the century.
Okay, so that seems to be like a harbinger of things to come, eh? You agree with what Has said, that it is actually a failure? If, let's say, it evolves into a Cold War between China and the US. Do you think that we are heading that way? Or you all don't have any idea, no opinion? Okay, Vaishnavi says no, don't think so. Looks a lot like chest buffing. Uh, yeah, that's true. I mean, oh, I forgot to put that one in. There was a meeting, right, at the UN Security Council, right, where they all said that they shouldn't be, or that they shouldn't use go into war, right? Do you see that? Um, yeah, they say no one can win a nuclear war. Yeah, so I think they basically sort of, kind of agreed, right, that they shouldn't resort to nuclear war, and yeah, so they are not. It should never be started. That's what they said. This was actually Russia out of the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. Yeah, that's what we think, right? If we are all rational beings, right, Rain? But who knows? We might actually have a very a wild card, right, amongst our erstwhile global leaders. Okay, let's take a look at what Schreller says. So this is actually from Schreller's reading, right, on the middle powers. Actually, he I mean, even though it's a reading on middle powers, he actually reviews, a bit about great power. So he basically says that, how he defines great power is that it is like has said, right, it commands a large share of resources or capabilities, so it does excel in all the component elements of state power. So, namely, right, when we talk about state power, we talk about size of population and territory, right? If you have a very small territory, small population, you're limited. It limits your ability to basically um, dominate, right? It also limits your ability to show your power, right? Then there's also resource endowment, um, economic capacity, military might, political stability, and competence. So when you look at all of these uh, all together, you find that probably the U.S. would actually be the one state that qualifies as a great power. Right? It is mostly ranked highly in all of these component elements of state power. And then you find that they also must possess greater than half the military capability of the most powerful state in the system. Right. So, um, yeah. So basically, it needs to, if let's say it were to combine its strength with any two poles, with another pole, right? It must be able to defeat a third pole. So that's how you define a great power according to Schreller. Yeah. Okay, so major powers, right? If you look at Olden, and it is one of those. It is actually a chapter in his chapter 6, I believe, in his subject guide. Yeah. Uh, Basically, if you look at major powers, Schreller actually talks about major powers as the great power of the second rank. Yeah, so it's not the top dog, right? It's the second. It's a second ranked great power. It does not possess a complete portfolio of capabilities, you know, and but it would have sufficient military capabilities to deter most states, and it does have an important influence on both global and regional balances of power because it can be actually playing the role of a supporter, a shirker, or a spoiler. And so basically, the role that it plays does have ripple effects on the global balance of power, on the regional balance of power. So if we look at how Kindleberger actually defines hegemonic states, it's basically he actually looks at those states as the states that are able to use their superior attributes to basically dominate, right? Dominate all other states in the international system. And usually you find that they would pursue foreign policies that would actually serve their national interests. You know? Naturally so, right? Because most states would actually be looking to enhance their national interests, right? And also um, to basically be the one that ensures hegemonic stability. Yeah. So they may actually use, like for example, right, use their financial means to ensure that their state currency, their national currency, becomes the international um, currency, right? Like the US dollar now. Yeah. Or they may also want to promote rulemaking is international institutions because that would allow them to define the rules and regulations, right? Um, that all other states need to adhere to, and they can actually ensure that those rules and regulations actually serve their own basic interests, right? And their values is reflected in those rules and regulations. So you see that in terms of the U.S., right, being the founding uh, founding member in the institution, right? I mean the state that gave great support to institutions like the Bretton Woods institution, like World Bank, IMF, WTO, and of course the UN as well. Okay, so you find that in terms of foreign policy choices, right, you find that balance of power politics actually um, is the driving force, right, behind foreign policy choices and actions of the major states. So these major states would try to build coalition that would actually help them to enhance their position internationally. They would also um, but then of course they would also face constraints. Yeah, you'll find that sometimes, right, major powers do actually uh, have their hands tied, right, through the very international institutions that they might have created. Yeah? Because those institutions may have actually developed more autonomy, right, from the founding states. Like that's part of the reason why you see, Trump, right, uh, at one point was threatening to pull out or not to fund the UN because he feels that it's in conflict or it doesn't serve the US interest as previously. Okay, so this is a video that looks at how the US actually became a superpower. Uh,
The modern United States is the most powerful country in human history, with over 800 military bases and 37% of global military spending. The US has become the leader of a vast, interconnected global system that has helped usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity and low levels of conflict. To understand America's position in the world, and why it's so pivotal for world politics as we know it, you have to go back to the country's founding, back to when America wasn't a global power in any sense of the word. During the first 70 years of its existence, the United States expanded in both territory and influence in North America, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean, in a wave of expansionism that resulted in the wholesale slaughter of the indigenous people who populated the continent. But early Americans were deeply divided as to whether the country should expand beyond the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This became a major debate after the Civil War, when some leaders, like post-war Secretary of State Seward, argued that America should push to become a global power. Seward succeeded in pushing a plan to purchase Alaska from Russia, but his attempts to buy Greenland and Iceland, as well as annex territory in the Caribbean, were all blocked by Congress. That's because some Americans, including many on Capitol Hill, had a strong anti-imperialist bent. These people worried about America getting more involved in global politics, as well as having to integrate populations from quote-unquote inferior races. And this opposition implied major checks on the imperialist urge to expand. But something was happening in the late 1800s that would change the debate about American expansionism. The Industrial Revolution produced explosive economic growth, and the bigger US economy required a more centralized state and bureaucracy to manage the growing economy. Power became concentrated in the federal government, making it easier for expansionist presidents, like William McKinley, to unilaterally push American influence abroad. The key turning point came in 1898, when President McKinley dragged the country into war with Spain over Cuba, despite some intense domestic opposition. The rising United States easily defeated the moribund Spanish Empire, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in the process. Over the next 2 years, the US would annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, Wake Island, and American Samoa. A few years later, the US took control of the Panama Canal Zone and sent troops to occupy the Dominican Republic. It also purchased the American Virgin Islands. This period of rapid acquisition of far-flung territories put the US on the map as a truly global power. During this time, America also began using its influence to protect its growing commercial and military interests abroad, installing pro-American regimes in places like Nicaragua, and playing a major role in international diplomacy regarding the Western presence in China. World War I showed just how much America's influence had grown. Not only was American intervention a decisive factor in the war's end, but President Wilson attended the Paris Peace Conference, which ended the war, and attempted to set the terms of the peace. He spearheaded America's most ambitious foreign policy initiative yet, an international organization called the League of Nations, designed to promote peace and cooperation globally. The League, a wholesale effort to remake global politics, showed just how ambitious American foreign policy had become. Yet isolationism was still a major force in the United States. Congress blocked the United States from joining the League of Nations, dooming Wilson's project. During the Great Depression and the rise of Hitler, the US was much more focused on its own region than on European affairs. Ultimately, America's ever-growing entanglements abroad made it impossible for it to stay out of global affairs entirely. In East Asia, the growing Japanese Empire posed a direct threat to American possessions and troops, bringing the United States and Japan into conflict. This culminated in the Pearl Harbor attack, bringing the United States into World War II. World War II would transform America's global presence forever. The United States was the only major power to avoid economic ruin during the war, and it was the sole country equipped with atomic weapons. As such, it was in a unique position to set the terms of the peace, and, with the aim of preventing another war in mind, it took advantage. The most famous example of this is the creation of the United Nations. The UN Charter set up a system of international law prohibiting wars of conquest, like the ones waged by the Nazis and the Japanese. It also served as a forum in which the international community could weigh in on disputes and help resolve them. This way, the Americans hoped, great powers could resolve their differences through compromise and law rather than war. But while the UN is the most famous of the post-war institutions, it isn't the only one. 730 delegates from all 44 allied nations came together in a small vacation haven in New Hampshire. Their goal? To establish a global financial system that would prevent another Great Depression and World War. The resulting agreement, called the Bretton Woods Agreement, ultimately became the backbone of the global financial system, resulting in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. By creating these institutions, the United States committed itself to being deeply involved in the world's problems. The issue, though, is that the world's second largest power, the Soviet Union, saw things differently. World War II had made allies out of the democratic West and communist East in the fight against Hitler, but that couldn't last. The United States saw Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and elsewhere as a direct threat to its vision of a free-trading, democratic world.
To a substantial degree, in one form or another, socialism has spread the shadow of human regimentation over most of the nations of the earth, and the shadow is encroaching upon our own liberty.
Fearful of Soviet intentions towards Western Europe, the US and other European nations created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance meant to stop Russia from invading other countries in Europe. Globally, the US committed to a strategy called containment, so called because it was aimed at containing the spread of communism everywhere on the globe. This new global struggle meant that the US had to exert influence everywhere, all the time. Instead of disbanding the massive military machine created for World War II, the wheels mostly kept turning. This had two main results. First, the US was pulled into unlikely alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and South Korea, seeing each of them as bulwarks against communist influence in their region. Secondly, the US began intervening, often secretly, in dozens of countries to contain Soviet influence. Sometimes this meant propping up sympathetic dictators, like in Iran. Other times, it meant supplying rebels with arms and money, like in Afghanistan in 1979 and Nicaragua in 1985. Over the course of the Cold War, the US intervened in hundreds of disputes around the globe, ending up with a complicated set of alliances, tensions, and relationships in basically every corner of the Earth. After the Berlin Wall fell, the US could have withdrawn from the system, severing ties with its allies and drawing down the size of its military. And while the US did decrease military spending, much of the military infrastructure and alliances from the Cold War remained. Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton decided that it was in both America and the world's interests for the United States, now the sole superpower on Earth, to continue actively managing global affairs.
We should be and we must be peacemakers.
NATO, created solely as a tool for countering the Soviet Union, stayed together and even expanded, a way of keeping European nations united in the absence of the Soviet threat. Washington's support for countries like Israel and Japan stayed intact, ostensibly as a means of preventing war in their respective regions. The global system of alliances and institutions created to keep the peace during the Cold War became permanent, as did the American military and political commitments necessary to keep them running. This system remains in operation today, and no leading American politician since the Cold War has seriously called for dismantling it. Except, perhaps, for Donald Trump. Trump has said contradictory things about these commitments, but he's consistently argued that American allies are not paying the US enough for its protection, and questioned the value of free trade. That calls NATO and even the World Trade Organization into question.
At some point, we have to say, you know what, we're better off if Japan protects itself against this maniac in North Korea. We're better off, frankly, if South Korea is going to start to protect itself.
Saudi Arabia, nuclear weapons?
Saudi Arabia, absolutely.
This is a sharp divergence from the consensus that has dominated US foreign policy since 1945, and something closer to the isolationism that came before it. So will President Trump act on some of candidate Trump's ideas, and reverse decades worth of institution building and alliances? We'll find out soon enough.
Okay, so I hope that gave you kind of a good overview of how America came to be a superpower and how far it's come. Or maybe you might see it as how much it has also reversed as well. But you also see that, I mean, in Biden's case, I mean, we are still, the jury is still out, right? We're not too sure what's happening. But he's slowly trying to reconnect with the allies and leverage the alliances, right, against China. Yeah. Okay, so that was the discussion or the look at great power. Now let's take a look at middle powers. So if you look at Alden, and I also looked at Nick, right? You see that basically how they are actually defined is states that commit their relative affluence, managerial skills, and international prestige to the preservation of the international order and peace. So basically, these middle powers are not, of course, not as affluent and not as powerful as the great powers, but they are interested in preserving the order, right? The current order, the current international order. So they see, I mean, of course, the idealistic imperative of these middle powers is that they see themselves as having a moral responsibility and a collective ability to protect the international order from those who challenge it. So they are mostly the ones that hold the line, the ones that try to maintain the stability of the system, because they actually not say profit from it, but they do gain from it. There is a benefit for them, right? If the system is stable, because they have actually progressed through um, the 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 rules and regulations that have been in place, right? And so they would want to ensure that it is sustained, right? So that their stability and order they can continue to maintain the stability and order in the states. So they are usually smaller than the major powers, right? But they have greater capability than small states. And often they are, sometimes people will see them as the status quo states, right? Because they want to maintain the status quo. So you see states like Canada, Australia, Norway, right, as middle powers. They are usually the ones that put themselves in the middle of the picture, right, as mediators between um, hostile states. Yeah. So that you find that there is actually no real characteristic that we can actually point to with regard to a middle power. It is usually you see that there's an assortment of states that may qualify as a middle power. So it could be developing middle powers, right, that may have a critical mass to be a major power. So critical mass in terms of the size, the population, the territory. Um, it could be declining major powers, or it could be rising minor powers. So if you were to look at South Korea today, would you actually consider them as middle powers? There's been quite a number of articles written about South Korea as a middle power, but do you think that it qualifies as a middle power? What would be states that you think would be an example of, let's say, the first characteristic, right? The first category of states, developing middle powers with requisite critical mass to be major powers. And then what would you consider to be declining major powers that would qualify as middle powers? What would be a rising minor power that would be a middle power? Can you think of examples? Can't think of any. You sure or not? Anybody can give me an example of a middle power that falls into one of those three categories. Singapore. Okay. Do you think what? All right, Singapore. Do you think which one would it fall into? The first, the second, or the third? India. So Rain says India. India, would you say that it is middle power with a requisite critical mass to be a major power? Is Germany a declining major power? Okay. So Rain thinks that it's a rising, but I wouldn't say it's a minor power because you would think of India having nuclear capabilities. Um, don't know. I wouldn't say that it's a minor power. If you want to talk about, okay, possibly what do you call it? Singapore is a rising minor power, possibly, but I don't even. I don't know. I don't think it is a rising minor power. Okay, so Yipeng says that the existence of the EU is absorbing the powers of Europe, and so looking at Germany, it would be declining. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I think in terms of India, we keep hearing. I mean, India and China, they were both sort of like emerging economies, and then they sort of like did a leapfrog, right? But China more so than India because India has been having a lot of political strife and all that, which probably contributed to its inability, right, to actually do a lot more. Yeah. Yeah. So Germany, I would assume is more of a number two, declining major power. Um, would you say UK is a declining major power? Would you see UK as a middle power, or would you see it as a major power? The other thing also, which is interesting, is Taiwan, right, and South Korea. Yeah, I mean, in terms of soft power, you would see that Taiwan and South Korea are quite effective, right, in accumulating soft power and projecting that soft power on the international arena. Yeah, but if you look at it, right, both of them actually start out as minors, small states, or rather, yeah, because they are both almost under the protection of the US, right? Okay, so for UK, Yong Seng thinks that it's still a major power or rising back to major power. Yeah, probably. Especially with its breakaway, right, from no, in the Brexit breakaway from the EU, it has to reassert itself, redefine itself, and you see UK actually redefining its defense and security policy, right? Early last, I think it was March in last 2021, right? And that saw a pivot to Indo-Pacific, right? They were going to be um, increasing its navy, moving towards and increasing its presence in the Indo-Pacific. Can Japan be considered a major power? Um, hmm. Could it be a major power, or would you see it as a middle power? I mean, in terms of military might, not exactly there, right? Um, Affluence, it does have relative affluence. I mean, but of course, Japan in 1980s compared to Japan now, I think economically, I think Japan was much stronger in the 80s, right before the bubble burst. Um, in terms of international prestige, I guess it's still kind of there. Um, I don't know if I would consider it a major power. Although, if let's say it were to accumulate more you know, nuclear capabilities, or it is allowed to assert its, and basically overtly, right, build its military, then yeah, I think it would be considered a major power. You know? But I mean, I would actually look at South Korea, and I would actually think that it straddles between a minor and middle power, but it's moving more towards middle power. Same with Taiwan as well. But then you would see that Taiwan, in terms of military, right, it's still very much dependent on great powers like the US. So it can play both cards, right? Which is actually very interesting because it can project itself as a state that is that requires protection and you know and all that, right, from China. But at the same time, you also know that it does play, it does have the ability to do dollar diplomacy, right? It does actually have call on the smaller states, right, to recognize it, and in return, it does give economic aid and other material resources to those countries. Yeah, so it can straddle both, and depending on which is more profitable or more beneficial to it, it may project itself as a middle power sometimes, and then sometimes it may actually take on more of a minor power role. Yeah. Okay, so this is a look at Nordic countries, and you'll find that Nordic countries are actually seen as middle powers, right? Relatively stable, um, affluent, also has some influence on the international arena, and sometimes they do act as mediators in peace accords and all that. So usually when we look at middle powers, we see that they may try to act as a middleman, right, between to try to pull different different states together into an arrangement, into an agreement, so as to basically allow for international order and peace. Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at Nordic countries, Nordic power.
You know we love our viewers, and lately it seems that a million of you, nay, a maximillion of you, want us to explore the strength of the Nordic countries. Well, here we are. How powerful are Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland? You're welcome. Now, technically, the Nordic countries are also made up of the Åland Islands and the Faroe Islands, and also Greenland. The Nordic countries are a culturally and politically overlapping group of parliamentary democracies located in Northern Europe. Individually, they tend to score near the top of most global achievement lists in areas like women's rights, environmentalism, quality of education, and homeless outreach. When taken together, they comprise the 7th largest area in the world at 1.3 million square miles. That's about the same size as India. But unlike similarly large nations, the Nordic countries have some of the lowest population density in the world, with only 26 million total residents. This is mostly because half of their land is uninhabited Arctic, thanks to Greenland. But even without Greenland, the rest of the remaining countries are still larger than Germany, France, and Italy combined. Economically, they are quite well off. When compared with the European Union, the Nordic countries have had much stronger GDP growth over the past 10 years. Only Finland has changed its currency over to the euro. Combined, their GDP reaches $1.7 trillion, which would make them the 12th richest area in the world, just below Canada. Per capita, Norway's GDP alone is 80% higher than the Eurozone, and its residents enjoy the highest standard of living in the world. In fact, all of the primary Nordic countries rank in the top 25 in the highest standards of living. However, the Nordic countries cannot be said to have a comparably strong military. Individually, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark rank from the high 40s to the mid-20s when stacked against the rest of the world. In fact, Iceland's only military is its Coast Guard, and they are the one NATO member without a standing army. When pooling the combined forces of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, you end up with $21.3 billion spent yearly on defense, or around 3.5% of the U.S.'s military budget. Although they might not have the strongest military, their presence is more relevant as an international peacekeeping force. Luckily, the Nordic countries have relatively friendly relations with most of the world and trade freely with many of their immediate neighbors. However, about a fifth of their trade is amongst themselves. In 2012, nearly a quarter of exports from both Denmark and Sweden went to other Nordic countries. Clearly, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland are pretty great places to live. A recent World Happiness Report listed all 5 in the top 10 happiest countries. Although the reason for Nordic countries ranking so highly, so regularly, has been attributed to their social welfare and high taxation. So how powerful are the Nordic countries? Powerful enough to be happy. But before you go out crazy, yes, we are going to keep making this series, and yes, we still want your input.
Okay, so how many of you want to move to Nordic countries now? One of the happiest places in the world, no? They don't want us. but taxes are high. That's the thing, right? Okay. So one of the things that we realize is that, immigration policy is probably quite tight. You're right. Yeah. So it might be even hard to get there unless you possibly get married to one of them. But some of them do not. I mean, some of these countries, Denmark also, I think, do not actually have a very high uh, marriage rate. Yeah, they prefer to cohabit. All right, ambiguous relations. So the middle powers and great powers actually have quite ambiguous relations because sometimes, right, middle powers are suspicious of the great powers. They don't like the great power actually penetrating into their region and threatening their sovereignty. So they may actually try to counterbalance the great powers' influence in the region. So this is and they do that by pursuing alliances amongst neighboring countries. So this is what you see in terms of Iran and Syria, right? Their posture towards the US. They are unhappy. They don't like the US presence in the Middle East, and they view great power penetration in the region very suspiciously, right? They see it as basically power play, right? Getting involved in the politics, power play of the great powers. Others may actually welcome, right, the presence of the global power in the region. So, for example, you see it in East Asia, right, where you find that, previously it was that the U.S. presence was welcomed as counterfoil against the regional powers like China and Japan. But of course, now Japan is a very strong ally of the US, right? So it's more like the US presence is welcome as a counterfoil against China, right? Because of China's claims on the on the islands in the South China Sea. Okay, so one thing that Nick and Schweller and Alden talked about was that middle powers actually do um, play a critical role, right? Because they are international peacekeepers. They are seen as international peacekeepers, mediators, as well as coalition builders. Part of the reason is because they are more status quo states. They would want to enforce, promote, right, the norms, the current norms and institutional rules and international uh, no, rule and order, right? And they may also be the catalyst, right? They may be the ones that actually push for certain global issues to be addressed. Yeah, so you see that in terms of Canada and Australia being involved in R2P, right? The responsibility to protect, um, that document, right? Looking at humanitarian intervention, right? They were the ones that actually spearheaded and um, you know, did all the groundwork for R2P. And then you find that they also tend to play quite a conspicuous role in their own region. They can be a balancer, they can be a kingmaker, or they can be a Turgis Garden. Yeah. And they would also pursue niche diplomacy. So in a way that they may selectively involve themselves in specific issues that they feel reflect their values, reflect their interests, their national interests, right? But you know, they only concentrate on just a few topics or a few issue areas only because they have limited resources. They are not like the great powers. They cannot spread themselves too thin. Right? So they would rather pursue certain issues where they can make an impact and basically build up a reputation for themselves rather than to spread themselves too thin given their limited resources. But they tend to be multilateralist, right? Because they tend to try to um, build coalitions, um, build multilateral agreements amongst states, right? So they also see themselves as bridge builders, right? So the example that was given in Schweller was the middle seven within the G20. So Canada, Australia, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Argentina being the middle seven, right? Being middle powers within the G20 and trying to um, collectively as well, right? push their collective interests onto the agenda of the G20. And of course, Turkey, as you know, sees itself as a middleman between the East and the West. So it always um, um, projects itself as a bridge. You know? Okay, but there are of course some criticisms that of the definitions of middle power. Part of the reason is that um, you find that they tend to play a supportive role because they are trying to uphold the international order and peace, right? So they tend to uphold and try to reinforce the status quo of the current international system that's been established, right? So um, they would they would usually basically not um, critique or not overturn, right, any of the regulations, or they would actually be a um, very enthusiastic enforcer, right, of the rules. Um, and also, one of the things that you realize with middle powers is that the definition is too vague, right? Because it is it's supposed to be all encompassing of all possible middle powers. But as you can see, there are quite a number of different types of middle powers different types of states that can qualify as middle powers. Yeah, so for example, emerging regional powers like Brazil, India, right? It's very difficult to situate them to basically see, talk about them as middle powers. So Busan and Olive Waver, of course, looks at regional security complexes, and in their work, they suggest that maybe it's better to look at these Brazil and India in terms of their um, impact on the region and to basically define them as aspiring regional hegemons, right? So, when we talk about middle powers, great powers, and all that, it's always on the international level, right? But it doesn't reflect very well. I mean, for example, for India, right, it doesn't reflect very well its prominence and its domination of its dominance in the region, right, where it would be seen as a great power in the region, right, a hegemon in the region. Okay. All right. Let's see. We are at 120, and my next slide is on small states, small, weak, and micro states. Shall we take a break at this point? 120. Let's break to 145. Would that be good? And then we come back and cover the small, weak, and micro states.